Hi, I'm Linda Mao, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Modern and speak with artist Kehinde Wiley about his exhibition, A New Republic. Now for Art This Week.
So you were born in South Central Los Angeles. You have described in many interviews your background, which actually was quite eclectic and enriching, I think, for a young child, as far as going to art classes at 11 and being sent to Russia at 12.
Right.
But I was also aware that there was also struggles and tensions, possibly for economic reasons, but also being a young black man in LA and in the United States. I was wondering if you could talk about how the environment of growing up in the kind of domestic situation in LA, how that maybe you think that formed some of the trajectory of your work.
Right. I think that there's a type of survival that has to happen growing up in the inner city in Los Angeles or any inner city neighborhood in America. Black people in this country have found numerous ways to find resilience and thrive within that context. My own mother was able to feed us and house us by having this amazing thrift store. It was almost like Sanford and Sons, that show where you would see just amazing junk, old tchotchkes, old furniture, gilded frames, patterned linens, and it really instilled in me this appreciation for old things, this sort of repurposing of things. Even years later, when I think about how my own aesthetic has evolved, something about it, something about taking the discarded and seeing it in a new way, through new lenses, is there, even from a very early age.
Some of the conversations you've had about your step after going to the Art Institute of San Francisco and Yale, and how after those two parts of your life, you then started to explore notions of black masculinity in your paintings. And I heard and read that you felt that wasn't something that could necessarily be explored at Yale, but that was your next step. I was wondering if we could talk about those notions of both black masculinity and masculinity in general, and how masculinity is still a subject that really needs to be continued as a subject of exploration, like how we define genders, how we define masculinity, and also maybe whether you can say whether you think black masculinity is something that's also confused not only in society in general, but within a black community, around black men themselves.
The performance of race and gender and class are exactly that, performances. These constructions that we live with are transforming before our very eyes every year. And what's a great challenge and opportunity as an artist is to be able to work within that construction and to be able to find new fields of providence, to be able to take the act, the mask, the performance, and imagine new means of expression. It's really daunting to grow up in a society where black men and their being is defined by antisocial behavior, hypersexuality, propensities towards sports. I mean, these limiting factors, these two-dimensional ways of seeing people and personas is at once incredibly frustrating, but also an opportunity for me as an artist to imagine a different possibility. And that's exactly what I do by using the body language of classic paintings. The DNA of early masculinity, divorced of blackness, you can find in early European easel paintings. Looking at a great Van Dyck or Frans Hals painting, you'll see very early on that the language of power and domination is encoded in body language, gesture, gesticulation. All of those things are very easily superimposed on the black and brown bodies of the 21st century, but the combinations arrived at give you something completely different, this sort of third object, something that's not quite the original, nor quite what we see and live with today. That sense of the uncanny, that sense that you're seeing something that's a bit familiar, but also breaks with the code that we understand is, I think, my desired effect.
I'm also thinking that in today's society, usually when we look at or get presented with a figure, it tends to be a female, actually. And whereas in the past, in paintings that you're often exploring, men would have their paintings made, and it would be a status piece, whereas now often the way of projecting or showing a portrait is often the objectification of women. And I'm wondering if you're, by putting men back into the kind of the forefront of somebody to be viewed, you're also questioning how we objectify and see someone, whether it's male or female, because we're just so used to seeing women now being painted or being photographed or being displayed.
That's right. And the nowness of it is important and very important in this context, because we're living in an Instagram generation now where the selfie is a type of portraiture that's automatic, and it's a means of doing exactly what was going on in those early paintings, which is announcing who you want to be and picturing yourself for the world to see. It changes day by day, second by second in the 21st century, whereas the call to arms for painting back then had to do with a type of indelible timelessness, the idea that these paintings and these portraits would be hanging in the great homes for generation after generation, and there was a type of acceptability that had to be arrived at very quickly. The type of disposability of the image that we have now in the selfie generation, I think, is fascinating. And that's one of the reasons why I really am drawn to the way that people are dressing today, the way that fashion will quickly decay, but oftentimes give you a quick sort of snapshot of what's actual. We don't, as viewers, have the same romantic fidelity to the moving or the fixed image. And it's oftentimes really important for an artist to be able to give you a real sense of the actual. Whether or not that's a performance or a fabrication, the idea is that you can elucidate some sense of fidelity in the viewer by pointing to what feels to be the actual.
I'm wondering about your choice to introduce women at the point that you did. I'm sure there was a reason for a specific project, for example, with the Economy of Grace, but also your choice not to do portraits of people, for example, black people at the beginning, but specifically men. Did you feel when you were going back through these paintings by the old masters and paintings often by white painters of white people, that you needed, of white men, that you need to first confront that idea of white men, white leaders, white slave owners with the black man before introducing women, that it needed to be that men confronting men, and therefore kind of a depiction of the erasure of black men in the past through no documentation?
It's a very important question.
And I guess maybe the other question is also because you're a male, maybe you felt like you wanted to explore portraits of men first.
Why black men? Why using black men as a gateway towards a larger conversation around empire, colonialism, and image making? I think that all of what I do on some level is self-portraiture, whether it be the depiction of men, women, racial backgrounds or countries. It ultimately comes down to me, the artist, me, the viewer, me, the experiencer, going out into the world and picturing that world in a way that makes sense to me. To that extent, my own personal sexual preference, my own personal gender identity, my own way of looking at power constructions are all implicit within that. It's important as well to look at power as a structure led by men. And in order to get to the core of the problem or the story, we have to look directly at images of male domination in this world. That wasn't necessarily a strategy. No artist, or I certainly, had no conception of my story in a very linear way, that I'm going to start with tackling this type of male Eurocentrist image making in the world, and then we'll move on to subject B. That was never part of it. I think all of it comes out quite organically and intuitively in some senses. The process itself will tell me exactly what my next move should be. I really do think that my work at its best is a surprise for me when it occurs. I don't want to go to work every day and to sort of feel as though this is a rote performance. I want to be able to push myself into areas where I feel uncomfortable, areas where I don't necessarily feel I have the full competency to answer all of the questions at hand. It's that level of danger, that level of fear, that fire that I run towards in my work that I think explains a little bit of the passion that people feel that they see in it.
So if there isn't a conscious decision to first of all tackle men because of I'm a man, or the hierarchy of men being at the top, and then I'll move on to women, if there isn't that, do you see a different role for men and women in your work, at least? Or do you feel like now that you've been exploring both portraits of men and women, that it's going to become a more kind of human scale rather than gender specific?
I have a tough time with gender divisions in terms of just speaking about my own authentic reaction to the people who I go out into the world to find. I think that oftentimes I find interesting people faces and feel compelled to make portraits regardless of gender. And I think that oftentimes there's this demand inside of me and in the world to sort of create these brackets for these experiences, to be able to say this is a gendered moment and this is a non-gendered moment. Often there's a desire to make a type of pure portraiture that's absolutely impossible. And what does that mean? That means that portraiture at its best is the opposite of a bowl of fruit or a landscape. Human beings, when looking at those inanimate objects, have a certain aesthetic excitement, but when looking at another portrait, there's a recognition that occurs. There's a transference, there's a type of identification. And as we get older and we start to develop prejudices and preferences and allegiances and tribes and systems and economies and scales, what we end up doing is responding to portraiture in much more sophisticated and crude manners as well. And I think that what I try to do is to take a few of those layers off, attempt to arrive at a type of clean, pure portrait painting, which is ultimately an impossibility. It's sort of this sort of Sisyphus rock that you push up and down this hill every year, again and again. But what comes out of it is this interesting a trace element of not only my own frustrations as a viewer and as a world citizen, dealing with all of the same internalized racisms and sexisms and so on, but it's also a trace of the tribe and the group that I belong to, this America, this 21st century America, trying to come to terms with how we look at young African girls in, let's say, Nigeria right now. All of that becomes this weird fractured mirror image of societies looking at others, but ultimately boiled down through my looking at what's in front of me.
Well, let's talk about World Stage then, this project that you're alluding to right now, as you've traveled around a lot of the world, really, with this project, finding people sometimes on the street and sometimes through publicities, I think, depending on the location. How much of that is also recognizing the US's foreign policy and involvement or perception of the world and the idea of the other?
Right.
Because I guess in this country, if you're born in this country or if you're born in any country, you can, depending on the prejudices, feel the effects of the other within. But then there's also the relationship between a country's sense of nationalism, where they suddenly bond on at least that level. You know, well, we might be different, genders or sexualities or colors, but at least we're all American or we're all Italian or whatever it is. How much do you see that also as maybe breaking that idea of prejudice?
Right, and to make matters worse, as an artist who has work shown not only in this country but in other shores, how is the work seen by different viewers? And is it ever possible to make a sort of pure American statement? I think the answer is no.
And does it need to be a pure American statement?
Well, there is, I think, something very American going on in my work. And I think I would define that by the contours of the decisions made as to why certain countries. I was looking at American anxieties, for example, with regards to our foreign relations, with regards to our economic present, in relationship to emerging markets, for example, China, Brazil, Nigeria, in relationship to security, Israel, the Middle East, places like Tunisia. All of this is, on some level, about America and its relationship to the outside world, but it's also, I hope, a moment for me to get into those places, on those streets, meeting with young people and looking at the way that they choose to self-present, right? So as much as it's sort of a top-down, outside-in thing, it becomes also an internal view as well, a type of modular shift that occurs on the interior. Is one dominating over the other? I would imagine so, because as the originator of the project, my presence looming in the room presupposes so much of what's going to occur. By virtue of me being there when the pictures are being taken, by virtue of my nods of yes or no when I feel as though a pose has been arrived at the right way. So there is an echo of the artist in every bit of the project, but I think there's also a very strong trace of those individuals who happen to reside in these paintings.
I feel like there's maybe two elements going on actually with that process. There's the actual process of finding the people, meeting the people, collaborating with them, and then there's the final piece. And the final piece perhaps goes around the world and it comes back to the States, and audiences in this country can view somebody else who's a human being who just happens to come from a different country, and there's a kind of equalizer going on there. But there's also the process of you actually having a relationship with these people at that moment that is on a much smaller scale and isn't public, but it's about an American citizen having a relationship with somebody else who's not American and having a positive one. What's that process like? How much time do you spend with them?
Well, that process is extraordinarily important to me, and that's one of the reasons why in this exhibition the video becomes a huge portion of it. Every time that I'm on the ground in any country, there is a sound guy and a film crew following my every move, and the process is just as important as the paintings and the sculptures that you see hanging on the walls. The process is very simple. I start with a simple provocation, pulling out my books, demanding, would you please give me just a moment of your time to take a picture in relationship to the work that I've already done before. Here, have a look at what I've done, right? And people can choose to say yes or no. Most people say no. And
I'm guessing some people in this country might recognize you and know you now, but then in other places they have no idea who you are.
Which changes the dynamic entirely. In fact, working in the West has this relationship to just add water celebrity that exists in popular culture all over the place. And so the idea that a camera would be shoved into your face and someone would ask you to be involved in something is completely normal. Whereas I've been in parts of the world where relationships with the state or relationships with any sort of attention from the outside is oftentimes considered a life-threatening situation in which there could be police or state pressure to get running. So you'll find that in the midst of trying to propose an idea, people are just so overwhelmed by fear. Why is all of this attention being directed towards me? It can't possibly be good. And so there is a set of techniques that I've evolved over time to deal with that. The cameras have to go away sometimes. Oftentimes you can't allow congregation of several people in one space to occur because it starts to create this sort of crowd mentality, a type of gawking where people maybe don't even understand what's going on, but they understand there's a foreigner there with cameras. You really have to balance it out. It becomes this weird type of knowing, this performance that in and of itself is just as valid as the paintings. And to that extent, it's very important for me to have the video work shown in direct relationship to the paintings.
You've mentioned performance a few times, and it wasn't actually a question I was going to ask, but I'm just curious, are you quite interested by dance and choreography? Because there is an element of choreography in the work. You know, I mean, you're working out how to position someone, and then sometimes there's pieces with more than one person, and they're situated together in a way that has a an interesting dance-like quality. Do you follow dance? Do you
I
like
do.
movement? Do you
I do.
dance?
I don't dance personally, but
As a rule, or you're just not confident?
I'm just not very good at it. Everybody can shake their ass.
Everybody can dance.
But not everybody can shake their ass well.
Okay.
Right?
So you know your limits.
I know my limits, and I know when to sit down. Right? But I've always been a huge fan of early conceptualists like Martha Graham. I remember looking at some of the Merce Cunningham collaborations with John Cage and thinking about the minimalist impulse in the movement of the body. And what you'll see in this exhibition is actually something that comes directly out of that tradition, where you take this very loaded and complicated notion of black masculinity, the performance of joy, and you boil it down to the smile and that endurance of that one note, that one tone that repeats over and over again. And within those nuances, you start to see a big, fuller picture of what's being proposed. But dance is with us all, and I think that whether it be a very elite form of dance, such as I've mentioned, or the type that you see in every dance club in the inner city in the United States, it's all about expressing what's inside of us, the dance, the urge to communicate our innermost feelings.
And the physicality of our actual being,
That's
which is
right.
always going to be present
Yeah.
in who we are. I know that a lot of the work that has influenced you in the past has been coming from Europe, and there's been, you've mentioned in the past interviews, many painters that have influenced you, but sometimes those painters don't necessarily work with very vibrant, bright colors. It's a little bit more muted.
Right.
I'm wondering if you could talk about your use of vibrancy, and
Right.
if that is a tactic maybe to jump out at the audience and
Right.
demand to be heard, seen, experienced, and no longer be invisible, or whether it's just a love for
Right.
color.
Well, color is something in the sort of Victorian puritanical American imagination that is fearful. That the idea is that too much color is vulgar, and that there should be a much more sort of quiet, muted sensibility. And you see that in some of my early examples. There's this large painting of a man with unwieldy hair, and I'm using this very muted seafoam green from Martha Stewart's 1999 home collection. That commentary on American sensibilities of color ties directly into the sense of the vulgarity of urban art systems, hip-hop itself. Who are these black bodies now running down the streets, influencing Vuitton and Givenchy and all of the major ivory tower houses? Our sensibilities concerning high and low, inside out, have all been turned inside out. However, it starts from a very puritanical and Christian place. There's these notions of purity, whiteness, cleanliness, whiteness itself being a metaphor for the presence of God, light itself being a metaphor for the presence of God, whether it be in stained glass or the ceiling frescoes of Tiepolo. It's something that you have to recognize. Richard Dyer, of course, wrote some amazing studies on this in his seminal book, White, where he goes through the history of Western easel painting and looks at Caspar David Friedrich's use of white as glowing and wrapping itself, shrouding itself across the body as being a true incarnation of the presence of God. How does color become a performance of race? Well, it's so much around us that I think we almost forget that it's in the bloodstream, so that it becomes almost like the language of painting seeping into the language of film. The ways in which we had classic portraiture in which one would never be cut off at the elbows or at the knees, but now for some reason filmmakers always follow that same principle. I think it goes with all ways of looking, ways of seeing. It's a story or an echo of an echo, a story of a story, and successive generations will take and do with it what they will.
I'm interested by how you are removing specific context for a person,
Right.
Abstracting it into somewhere between an unknown territory, a surrealist experience, but also a political act, and seeing the person for who they are, kind of comforted or enveloped in a pattern. And sometimes that pattern comes in over it, for example, in Conspicuous Fraud Series 1 or Portrait of Venetian Ambassador, age 59, the second. I wonder if you could just talk about how that moment when you decided to use pattern and backgrounds in this manner.
Yeah. Well, I began with these fields. I began with color fields because I wanted to get away from the figure-to-ground relationship that exists in classic portraiture. And that relationship is a very simple one-to-one relationship between the rational man and the irrational land. The man is oftentimes erect, full frontal, dominating the picture plane, and the world around him is considered to be this sort of unknowable, uncontrollable, feminine space that must be somehow gridded out and understood. And there's some interesting ways of thinking about that, and many people have written much about it. But I think that for me it was interesting to sort of create these voids, imagining this break in time where there was the original portrait painting, and now there's this after world. And the question is, where does my work sit? I was fascinated by the work of Smithson, who created some really interesting earthworks where he would take rocks from New Jersey and he would present them in New York, and he would name them the Surd. And the Surd for him was the space that existed between New Jersey and New York. You're not seeing either, but the work provokes you to think about the space in between. And I think the spaces within my own backgrounds have a lot to do with that absence or that gap between the landscape and the absence of space, so sort of these blanket fields. Only later did I begin looking at the actual period where the poses were coming from. The late French Rococo, for example, would elicit a wild French Rococo background that then started to take on a personality of its own. It demanded space in this field. It started pushing forward and almost sort of demanding to be visible, just like these black and brown bodies are now being sort of insisted onto museum walls throughout the world. It becomes this interesting sort of metaphor for presence and absence. Is it ever possible for art to correct for the past? I think the answer is clearly no. But in the end, we're operating within that sort of Surd area. We're operating within that gap between the presence and the absence.
Just following from that very last point, do you think then that one of your roles as an artist is not correcting the past, but presenting a new present and future for museums and art galleries and history that was lacking before? Is that part of your goal?
I think so. I think the goal of the artist, or I'm not going to make platitudes, I'm just saying that the goal for myself is to take the familiar and to make it into something that I don't recognize any longer, and then represent it in such a way that it feels completely rational, completely sensible. But in the end, there is no up, there is no down. It's simply a set of affinities, associations, and fascinations.
We want to thank Kehinde for speaking with us. For more information on him, go to KehindeWiley.com. For more information on the exhibition, go to themodern.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.